Welcome back to another episode of StablePod, a podcast where we host conversations with the individuals who are shaping the future of decentralized systems. I'm your host, Juan Esquivel. Today's guest is actively building a next-gen modular lending protocol without limits. Michael Bentley is the co-founder and CEO of Euler Labs, the main team contributing to the development of Euler V2. In today's episode, we dive into everything from the rise and fall of Euler V1, the Euler's team's resilience and perseverance to come back and build V2, how Euler V2 innovates and evolves how lending protocols work. And of course, we even touch on the future of the Euler DAO. Gustav, would love to hear your thoughts on our conversation.
Yeah, I think we touch upon, I think, like a lot of interesting topics, about like how, there's like a newer, like innovative player is kind of like trying to like push the boundaries and close the gaps between, like the modular, with like the modular approach, right? Where we, see kind of like, two quite like, extremes at the moment with, like Aave being in one end, very like monolithic. And then we have, like Morpho on the other end of the spectrum, being much more like, modular and open, right? So Euler kind of comes in the middle and then tries to like bridge the gap between the two. And there's some really interesting things around, like how to do like capital efficiency. And then it's also always very fun to talk with someone who kind of has decentralization and permissionlessness as like a key component of it, right? So I think Euler V2 is it's a super exciting product, and Euler in general, like the Euler Labs, is a really exciting team to follow.
Yeah, they're really, really smart people over there. I quite enjoyed our conversation with Michael. Exciting stuff to see what V2 can bring to the table. I did definitely compare it a lot to Morpho because I think it's a good baseline understanding of kind of the similarities and the improvements that they're making with V2. So I hope if you're very interested into lending protocols, and of course we do touch on some governance in the conversation, but if you're interested in all of that, hearing from really smart people over at Euler, I think you'll find our conversation very interesting. So without further ado, our conversation with Michael Bentley. Welcome to the podcast, Michael Bentley.
Thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to talking about all we've got to talk about.
Awesome. Glad to have you. Before diving into today's discussion, I think I just want to acknowledge and, of course, give a tremendous amount of credit to your team for its resilience and perseverance over the last year. Of course, Euler V1 was... There was an exploit that happened in March, I believe, of 2023. And of course, your team is still around and now building the next iteration of Euler. So I just want to give credit where credit is due first off before we dive into the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It was definitely a really kind of tricky year last year, to say the least. And not easy for any of us, Euler users, or the whole Euler team. The whole Euler community was pretty knocked back by everything. But ultimately, we're still here. The exploit happened, all the funds were recovered, and then we're hopefully coming back a lot stronger now as a team with a much more ambitious and better product at the end of it. So yeah, excited to still be around and in the arena with you guys.
Awesome. Could you walk us through a little bit about like the last 12 months of building V2 has looked like, more from like the emotional and the experience side of things from the team side of things, kind of what has transpired. It's not easy, right? It's not easy to go with what you went through and then build something back up from let's say scratch. So I'm just curious to hear more about kind of the team dynamics and all the thoughts that's gone on behind the scenes.
Yeah, so the exploit happened in March, and then I can't remember exactly how long it took, but it wasn't an immediate. The recovery process took several weeks, right? It was very stop-start. I wrote a big blog post about all the events because they were just kind of completely crazy, massive roller coaster. So that period, the recovery itself, and making sure users got all their assets back took probably a couple of months, frankly, for everything to really wrap up there. And then, of course, we needed a little bit of a reset. I think everybody at the team was really shaken by what had happened. So we took a week or so off, I think, and then we decided to all get back together, meet up as a team in person because we're a remote only group. We started back in 2020 during COVID, and there's no Euler base as such. We've got a little office in London, but we're all distributed across the globe. So we decided to meet up at a retreat and just kind of heal together a little bit, talk about what had happened, and then start to talk about what do we do next, right? Do we just fix this one line of code where the bug happened and redeploy, or do we go with something different? And ultimately, yeah, we'd already had vision about ways that we wanted to improve the protocol and do things differently. And that most of the discussion centered around, I think everyone agreed that actually we wanted, if we were going to do this and stick together and come back fighting, we wanted to come back with something really that would really knock people's socks off and something completely different.
So continuing that point there is nicely into my next question, which is when did you first start to ideate V2? I'm sure when you had V1 around, you already were thinking like ways to improve it. So I'm curious to hear kind of like that transition period where you kind of maybe had some scratch notes of like what you had initially envisioned to improve V1, but now you had the opportunity to start over and just kind of a blank slate and then implement these V2 improvements and iterations. So curious to know more about kind of when did you first start to think about these ideas for V2 and kind of like how you, or did it all mostly come post exploit now that you had a fresh, blank slate?
Yeah, a lot of the ideas I think were already kind of bubbling away before the exploit, really. I mean, when you launch a product for the first time, of course it's not perfect, and of course the things you don't like about it, things you want to improve, right? That's happened with Maker as well. Like the way that the whole project's evolved a lot over the years, and you learn a lot about your users, who your users are, and what their kind of desires and wants and needs are as well. So some of the things that we decided that weren't working really well with Euler V1 were the permissionless aspect. We really had this ambition early on in the project to make Euler this permissionless protocol. And you could, to a degree, list lending and borrowing markets in a permissionless manner, but not in as flexible a way as you can with V2. And you couldn't use many things as collateral, for instance. There were lots of limitations around the permissionless elements of it. So we felt like we could do a better job on that front. And we had some ideas about designs that would be able to make that happen, which we can talk about later. The other thing that we were increasingly sort of disillusioned with, I think, certainly myself, was the way that governance was working. I was really optimistic and excited about decentralized governance systems when Compound launched and I saw their system. I wasn't too familiar, frankly, with the MakerDAO system, which is obviously like one of the older decentralized governance systems in the space. But Compound's one I thought looked really clean, it looked really fresh, and I thought it would really, really work well, having this well-designed on-chain governance system. And Euler's, we had this ambition to move to fully decentralized on-chain governance, and it just looked like it was going to be really, really tricky to get there. And then doing all this on-chain governance and management of risk and all the rest of it, it ended up not being anywhere near as decentralized as we were hoping, and just things weren't going the way we'd liked. And so that was one element as well that along with the permissionless listing of new markets and so on, that we wanted to try to see if we could improve.
So I have like a question for this, because I mean, of course, like you had like the V1 out, but back then you were also kind of like the new kid on the block when you launched that, right? Because I mean, in DeFi we have these like really big players that sits on like a really large part of the market. Aave, Maker, Spark now is part of Maker, and so on. Do you feel like there's like a bigger pressure on like the newer players to like push innovation maybe a little bit further, because they have to go in and basically like compete for like market share, and they're kind of coming in and in some way have to like redefine the vertical a little bit, because if they don't really have the competitive advantage in what they're trying to do, then it will be like difficult for them to get market share. Like how do you feel like that pressure is on like some of the newer protocols launching?
Yeah, I think it's partly a pressure, but I suppose in a way the pressure's on the established, the incumbents to kind of to keep defending themselves, because when you've already got a product that's working well, you don't really want to tweak it and make too many changes, right? You feel nervous about making changes, and there's like a common phenomenon throughout the decades, right? That big established businesses are slow moving, and it's always on the new upstarts to come in and try and drive innovation. And there's something thrilling and exciting about that, and freeing about it, right? Like you don't have lots of users that are angry about every little change you make. You have a lot of freedom of expression when you're building something from scratch. So yeah, pressure. I think it's obviously harder to disrupt established projects. That's true, especially ones in this industry. Liquidity tends to beget more liquidity, right? It's part of what makes your product useful, especially in lending and borrowing. If you don't have liquidity, then people can't borrow from you. And if there's no borrowers, then the lenders don't turn up, right? So the chicken and egg, the kind of cold start problem's really tricky to get past in this industry. It's not good. It's not enough to just make something 10% better than Aave, right? You have to really make something way better than Aave for people to go, ooh, I want to do, go and check that out, right? And there's a little bit of pressure there, but I also think it's just really a lot of fun.
I think that's like a very, really good way to look at it, right? I think, because of course I've worked with Maker for the last 6 years or so. So like the other perspective was like the one I had on like the other side. But yeah, like I like that view of things. So like now you're coming out with this like, new product, and we'll later on like dive a little bit more into it. Like, but I also just wanted to hear like, what is like your expectations for, how like the Euler V2 launch will go? Like what is like some of the things that you're like excited for? What like some of the things that you expect to go well, right?
Yeah, good question. Well, I'm excited to see people using the stuff that we've spent so long building again, right? That's just one of the best things as a builder is, and especially when you see somebody that you've never even spoken to about the project, like, if you see somebody that you've kind of, you've like demoed the protocol to, or like an investor or a friend or whatever, and they're using it, it's like, well, of course they would. But when you start to see people talking about your product online, who you've never met before from the other side of the world, that's the really fun bit, right? You've kind of built something cool and useful for people when you see that. So I'm looking forward to seeing that again, and I'm sure there will be people saying good things about what we've built. It's ultimately about not trying to run too fast. We don't have like these lofty ambitions to get billions of TVL overnight or anything like that. I think ultimately I'm quite happy to see us launch and have a slow, steady, organic growth. And see the real use cases of Euler sort of shine, and see it shine where, we'll talk about the product shortly, but I think the V2 fills gaps in the market that currently aren't being, dealt with by incumbents like Aave and Maker and others and so on. So I'd like to see Euler shine in those regions first and foremost, even if they're not, massive markets or anything.
So maybe not as quickly as Athena's rise to fame, right? I know there was some discussion there on crypto Twitter. They moved pretty quickly and grew pretty quickly. So
yeah, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't be upset if we were able to grow at that sort of pace. That was really like a massive overnight success, and hats off to them for sure. No, I don't have expectations that we'll be the next Athena in that regard, sadly. But I wouldn't complain about it if we were.
Yeah, we had Seraphim on the podcast a couple of podcasts ago. It was like perfect timing for them. I think the right kind of macro, everything kind of just fed directly into their narrative, their protocol, and everything kind of worked out. And we'll see kind of long term how things play out, of course. So you touched on it in your previous comments. I just want to kind of dive into this next section, which is kind of how would you describe the current state of DeFi lending, the rest of the competitors in the space in 2024? Yeah,
so I think there's a few different models of lending out there at the moment. The most successful ones, I think to date, have been represented by like these large monolithic protocols like Aave, where essentially you have a relatively small set of assets that cross-collateralize one another, allow people to lend and borrow against them, each of those assets. But they're all tied in a group, and they're kind of protocols only as strong as its weakest collateral. And so they tend to be characterized by fairly risk-averse governance processes, managing risk for folks, and not too many markets. And then on the other side, we've seen the emergence of with success with Morpho on some of the more isolated markets, right? This was like an approach to lending that's been tried before, but I think Morpho have done a better job of it, and maybe they've hit like the timing right a bit more. There's not just, sometimes I think Kashi launched with isolated pairs back in 2020. It was a sushi-based lending protocol, right? And they had these isolated pairs, and it just never really took off. And Morpho Blue's come back and sort of reinvented that. And that's quite a nice model for in many different ways, right? Because it allows more flexibility for the types of assets that can be listed. And I think they've had some success there. So yeah, there's those two basic models in the market right now, but there's massive gaps in between those two extremes, from isolated pairs where the risk is massively isolated and kind of anything goes, all the way up to these kind of large monoliths, which are paternalistically managed by a DAO, and they're very sort of constrained in terms of what can be listed. All sorts of nice things in the middle. A project that I've followed for a while that I quite like is Silo. With Silo, they have isolated pairs, but the isolated pairs are kind of indirectly connected to one another. How it works essentially is, you have asset A, B, and C, and there might not be a market to borrow C using A directly, but you can essentially bridge loans. So you can use A to borrow B and then B to borrow C. And so they kind of chain together collateral sets in a nice way like that. So that's something I would class as sort of in the middle between a Morpho Blue and an Aave, but still fairly on the sort of isolated primitive side. And there's this huge gap in the middle. We saw years ago a protocol called Rari Fuse, which I'm sure you remember, which is maybe slightly on the more degen end of the spectrum. And with that protocol, they essentially were creating compound forks, and each compound fork could be permissionlessly deployed, and it would have a totally different set of assets in it. And the person who created the fork would configure LTVs and so on. And so you'd have these multiple little mini compounds sitting in space, and they're all disconnected from one another, but they all have very different risk profiles. And that had some product market fit back in probably 2021, I suppose, and ultimately didn't survive. I think through a bunch of security issues, of course, but that's another model of lending that's kind of interested me over the past few years. So there are all these different models, and what I'll tell you about soon is that essentially Euler kind of unifies all those different models and allows users themselves to build anything from a kind of really basic Morpho Blue isolated pair all the way up to an Aave and all these different things in between. And you can build things like Rari, but have them connected to one another and so on. So yeah, I'm super, super interested in how lending protocols are structured. And I really like getting into sort of the weeds of like, how they're sort of configured in terms of their risk management and risk profile and so on. So yeah, I like what we have out there today, but I think there's still a lot more to bring.
Where does this interest come from, if I may ask?
I mean, honestly, I got started in lending fairly indirectly, I suppose. I started in crypto probably properly in 2017. I used to build little trading bots and so on. And I think in the early days, Maker really never interested me that much. I just don't think I quite got it. I was more interested in other things. I was actually, at one point going to build like an NFT-based trading, fantasy football trading game and something completely different. But in 2019, 2020, I started to get quite interested in Uniswap and Compound and Yearn in particular. Those were the three, in 2020 with DeFi summer, that's really attracted my attention. And at Compound, they have obviously like a linear kink interest rate model, and it's kind of rigid, right? These models, they work for an asset only when they're really well configured, right? They try to provide a sort of sensible interest rate for a certain amount of demand on the market. But if the economic conditions change, then maybe the interest rate model needs updating, and like governance needs to get involved and so on. So my first interest in lending was around how you can create decentralized interest rate models. And that actually did bring me back to the Maker system. And I found some blog posts on there about how Makers handled this problem in the past. So, and then I started to get into the weeds of Maker and start to really appreciate that design a lot more. And it all started with interest rates. And I used to think about there's this branch of maths called control theory, and whether you could apply control theory to interest rates and so on. But as I just sort of fell down this rabbit hole, then I started to think more deeply about the structure of lending protocols, like how do they work, how do they compare to what we have in the world of traditional finance, and how can we kind of recreate useful products for people that kind of mirror the successful products that exist out there. So yeah, it's been a long and convoluted journey.
Michael, curious if you have any thoughts on this topic or this idea of the balance between the elegance of you're coming into it as a builder. Of course, you're coming into it thinking in terms of a design, like a system designer, right? You're a mechanism designer, and then like the balance of like actually building useful products in UX, right? Like there is, and Paul from Morpho has talked about this, where it's like they want to be more infra, they want to be more under the hood. And then like, of course, there's a whole like behemoth to tackle, which is like the actual application layer, the more kind of like user friendly layer. So curious to hear kind of like what you think or what your perspective on is in terms of balancing that as a builder.
Yeah, I mean, me and Paul have I think quite a lot of overlapping ideas on this front, and we've also had a few debates about like what differences between what's like a product versus a protocol, and like whether that's an interesting distinction or not, or what the differences might be. The way we've been trying to build things at Euler is through these principles of modularity, like making simple modules that do one thing or like a small number of things really well, and they're very easy to test. And then the idea is that you can package those modules up, compose them with one another, and then build products out of them. And so the modules themselves should be really simple kind of primitives, and then the composition of the modules is where you get really nice like products that solve problems for people and have, that's where all the UX stuff comes in. But the modules themselves could be just so simple and kind of boring and do almost nothing. So that's how we've been thinking about things. In the first iteration when we were building with Euler, we sort of didn't think about things in that way, and that was one of the things we didn't necessarily like about the protocol. We built it as a kind of monolithic product from the outset, and the problem with that is that when you then discover things about your users that they want something different, it's very hard to kind of change direction, or it's already rigidly defined, and the complexity is already there, and it's hard to change complex systems. It's much easier to change simple systems, right, and make an edit. So building in a modular fashion, I think, has enabled us to build really cool things, really cool infrastructure, and then as a team work with different people inside the team and outside the team to then develop products that people want using those individual modules. So that's been our philosophy for building V2, really.
Michael, do you think it's easier to build, scale, and run monolithic protocols? That's kind of like why the trajectory of DeFi in its history. It's kind of, we started with this very simple approach. Once we had enough infra, it allowed us to now come out with these new, more modular type of protocols, such as V2. Curious if you think it was the training wheels. It was the thing that was the easiest, but we're going to evolve, and that's kind of where you're headed.
It's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know what's easier. I guess it depends over what time scale and like who your target audience is. The nice thing about building a kind of monolithic product is that you can really focus in on if you know your target audience, you know your user, you build exactly what you want for them and just ignore everything else, right? And you can package it up, really directed product just made for them. When you build modular, things take a lot longer to build, I think, because you have to break everything into isolated components, test each component individually, and then start to build them back up. And building them back up itself is kind of like building a whole project from scratch. So it definitely takes longer to build modular products. But then, like I say, you have that flexibility over the long run to then do more with them over time. And you don't have to go back to the drawing board every time somebody wants something new, right? So I think I think there are just trade-offs with the two approaches, and I'm not sure what wins out in the long run. I sort of feel like we have this philosophy that protocols should last a long time, like simple primitives should last a long time, whereas products maybe don't, right? You build them for a few years, they target an audience in that time, and then they maybe die. Look at Uniswap V2. It's by no means a perfect product, but it was the perfect product in 2020 to launch and a successful AMM sort of project with. But yeah, V2 has died. V3 will probably be superseded by V4. So these are kind of products, I think, that are perfect for the time they're there, but they don't last forever. The goal with some of the things we've built is we really want it to be there for forever, or at least for a very, very long time. Kind of like TCP IP, right? Like no one's replacing that anytime soon. It's just been around forever. As a kind of primitive protocol that people build on top of. So Yeah, the thing about products is that they also allow you to extract value from users, right? Because you satisfy a need that they have immediately, and then there's potential value extraction there, and then that allows you to kind of iterate and build bigger and bigger products. So we see that with more established products today, that they already have ways to they already have a kind of moat and ability to generate value, which you can then sort of feed back into growth. Building primitives and kind of simple modules doesn't always get you, allow you to extract value from users. People who invented the internet didn't really make much money from it, and don't extract value from it today, right? It's for everybody who built the products on top of it that did.
Yeah, I think also like, from like a conceptual standpoint, like some of these like newer products coming out, I also just like more complicated, right? I think like we have kind of like branding, like those like DeFi 1.0, which was, very similar, right? You put in like an asset, there's like a ratio you need to maintain and you can borrow against that asset, right? But of course, like, a lot of the products we see today, and also what I mentioned a bit earlier with kind of like there's this like pressure on like innovation, right? And of course, it's just like the longer, people look at problems, the more enlightened they become on like how to solve those problems, right? Which I think is also like the journey that you guys went through with like the difference between like Euler V1 and now Euler V2, right? That I think back in like, 2018, 2017, when, like the first, borrowing and lending protocols were like being designed, our like understanding of like what we actually could do was also just at a very different stage, right? But yeah, I think maybe this is a good segue to jump into Euler V2.
Yeah, let's do it. Michael, could you walk us through at a high level the core architecture of V2? There's EVC, EVK, EPO. Just curious to hear more kind of a quick rundown of what's going on under the hood for V2.
Yeah, so the idea for V2, it's what you call it's modular lending protocol. So we've got these three major modules, but even within those larger modules, there are kind of sub-modules and sub-modules, right? So it's everything's been built in that sort of manner. And the idea really is that with V2, you can rebuild any kind of lending protocol that you want. So I mentioned a few other designs earlier, right, from the isolated pairs all the way up to the monoliths and everything in between. With Euler V2, you can take these modules and you can rebuild a Morpho Blue or a Silo or a Compound or an Aave or indeed synthetic ASICs like Maker's DAI. You can build essentially any credit-based system by combining different components within the modular architecture. So at the heart of it, we have these three large components. The EVK is the Euler Vault Kit. Everything in the Euler ecosystem is a vault. A vault is just a place where people deposit assets. Those assets can either be used as collateral to borrow from other vaults, or they can be lent out, so they can accept borrowing from them. Now, when you deploy a vault on Euler, the vault creator is the one that decides the risk parameters for the vault and whether or not the vault creator is going to, establish a governance process over the vault, or it could decide to revoke governance entirely and leave the vault ungoverned. But key decisions the vault creator needs to decide if this vault is going to accept borrowers. Then what kind of collateral is it going to allow people to use for borrowing from this vault, and under what circumstances? That process has been kind of abstracted. The way that vaults talk to one another, Euler, is handled by a totally different module called the EVC, which is the Ethereum Vault Connector. And the Ethereum Vault Connector really just handles, in a very abstract way, it handles that communication between vaults and the rules that they define for one another under which lending and borrowing can happen. Yeah, people know, right, that generally in DeFi, borrowing is always over-collateralized. So the EVC doesn't even have a concept necessarily of over-collateralization. It's just whatever conditions the vault governor decides for when borrowing can happen, the EVC will enforce whatever those conditions are. And in many cases, that is a basic over-collateralization requirement, right? The borrower must remain over-collateralized given some loan-to-value parameters that have been set up. But in general, the EVC can handle much more general communication between vaults and conditions for borrowing. So the things that use as collateral need not even be necessarily other vaults as such. They could be NFTs, they could be real world assets, they could be other types of tokenized agreements and so on. In the long run, really anything's possible with the EVC mediating communication between the vaults. But of course, today largely things have centered around over collateralized lending and borrowing of fungible assets. And for those assets, typically you need pricing, and pricing is typically provided by oracles, right? You need to be able to value assets if you want to establish an over collateralization condition. So we have a separate module that essentially handles all pricing, and it can handle any kind of pricing that exists out there today. So it can handle regular things like Chainlink. It can handle some of the newer systems provided by like Redstone and Pith. MEV integrated sort of oracles, DEX-based oracles. It's a very, very flexible pricing system that's itself is also kind of abstracted out and allows also any sort of pricing system to be built in. In the long run, we think even sort of Oracle-free pricing could be built within the Euler kit itself as well. So ultimately, it's a big developer's kit. It's a big playground for people to piece these modules back together with one another and build almost anything that they want.
So, of course, this comes back a little bit to the complexity that I mentioned before, right? Because of course, I mean, it's basically like a boring lending, protocol where you can do so many things, right? You mentioned a little bit earlier, how do you basically try to target products contra, being infrastructure. So of course, with something where there's so many opportunities, so many things people can do, how do you then envision you guys steering people into some of the use cases that you guys are excited about? How do you expect working with this? Because I can imagine something like this would require quite a bit of education, of course, but also kind of making people realize, hey, what you're doing over here, you can actually do it here in a better and more flexible way, and potentially also a cheaper way and things like this. How are you guys kind of trying to steer that direction?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does allow people to build lots of things, and it is more complex in that sense. But kind of what we did when building it was really abstracted all the properties of a lending protocol and then packaged them up. So it's kind of rigorously tested in that sense, and it's kind of simpler in some ways to actually combine things and build something with this kit than it is to design something from the ground up and kind of reinvent the wheel or build a product from scratch in some ways. But yeah, you have to educate people on how to build and compose these different modules together with one another. We have a vault creation kit that helps people to build and deploy vaults. We'll be working a lot on blogs and explainers and articles that show people the kinds of things that they can build with Euler and how it differs from existing projects out there. And I think, on terms of attracting people, I think it's about showing them that you can do things that you simply can't do elsewhere, that aren't being done efficiently elsewhere. So the Athena examples may be a good one. Athena kind of just came on the scene, and a lot of the monolithic protocols were interested in listing Athena, but they're also nervous, right? Can we trust this new asset? Is it sensible to add a new collateral asset to our monolith? If it blows up, then it could destroy the whole protocol. And so, the monoliths are kind of struggling with what to do here. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can add Athena to a single pair, but is it really that efficient to do that? Wouldn't it be more efficient if Athena assets were in a kind of larger cluster of vaults that could cross-collateralize and borrow from one another? And so, the ability to kind of experiment and do something that's in between those two extremes, I think is a novel use case that you could see working with not just Athena, but a lot of these new assets that are coming online today. There are tons of new stable coins, each offering slightly different features in terms of whether they distribute yield back to users or whether or not they have permissioned transfers or, however all these new fancy real world asset type markets work. All of those you can build on the Euler Vault Kit, right? And they're very, very difficult to build on other protocols. Either to add them now is kind of dangerous or just relatively difficult, or you can build only very, very simple things. Whereas with this Euler Vault Kit, people can come in and build really, really great products around new stable coins and new real world assets very, very quickly. So I think once people get the hang of it, they'll see that it's actually not so difficult and it's really fun and provides a lot of utility to the marketplace.
Michael, so putting on my marketer hat, which I'm already wearing, a good way to kind of when you launch a product, a good way to basically inform and teach the end user or the target user is basically to either compare or kind of show how this new thing is similar to or different or better than the existing competitors. So I'm curious, like in my mind, my mental framework is kind of like Morpho Blue, but better is what I've heard. So just curious, for our listeners that maybe still don't fully wrap in their head, like how is Euler V2 supposed to be better? How is it different from what Morpho Blue and Metamorpho Vaults, the setup they have over there? Why is V2 better?
Yeah, so firstly, I should say I'm a fan of the Morpho project, and huge congratulations to those guys on their success, because it's really great to see a new and innovative lending player come online. So I'll compare and contrast in that spirit, but it is quite different from Morpho Blue and the Morpho system. There are some underlying similarities, of course. If you look at Morpho Blue, how it works is that there's essentially you have a vault where people can deposit assets. They can lend assets to that vault, and then they have another market that's used for collateral. That collateral is what I call held in escrow, essentially. So if you deposit ETH as collateral to borrow USDC, the ETH just sits there in sort of escrow. It's held by the contract, right? It doesn't go anywhere. And meanwhile, the borrower using that ETH as collateral can borrow USDC. The people lending into that USDC market are only earning yield because of those ETH, the people collateralizing that ETH. They're not earning yield from anybody else anywhere else in the system. So it's a nice system because it's isolated, but it's a capital inefficient system because it's just a pair. As a lender, I'm really dependent on those particular collateral users sticking around and continue to borrow from me. On Aave, that things don't really work like that, right? If I come in and deposit ETH into Aave and collateralize it, I can borrow USDC. I can also borrow many other assets. And meanwhile, my ETH is also being lent out. It's being rehypothecated and therefore earns me yield. So overall, Aave is a more capital efficient system. It's less flexible and maybe more risk averse, whereas Morpho Blue is kind of inflexible but more risk isolated. With Euler, if we take the Morpho Blue system, with that two pairs of vaults, it could be represented in the Euler system as two vaults. Of course, we could build the Morpho system where we have, escrowed vault and a lending vault, but we could actually extend this in multiple ways. First thing we could do is just let the two vaults borrow from one another. So we'd let the ETH borrow from USDC and USDC borrow from ETH. So we'd let rehypothecation happen. That's actually how vault pairs work on Silo today. So you could recreate Silo using Euler just by adding that simple step. You could then start to add more vaults to the system, though, and say, well, my USDC vault is not just going to accept collateral from the ETH vault, but it's going to accept collateral from anywhere else in the system. When you create a vault on Euler, you can accept collateral from anybody else's vault that's ever been created. And so say you guys had a nice set of vaults out there somewhere else in the system, I can choose to accept collateral from your vaults as well. And what that does is it, of course, increases the capital efficiency of the system. If those ETH depositors, those people collateralizing ETH disappear one day because, the market's changed, I can still earn yield as a USDC lender from other people that are taking out loans against my vault. So it's just way more capital efficient. I don't have to be constantly moving around my deposits, chasing yield in all sorts of different vaults. I can be more passive within the system, just like I can be more passive in Aave. So I think it's a lot more freedom, a lot more capital efficiency at the Euler base layer than you have in the Morpho Blue system. And you get a lot of the capital efficiency benefits that you would get on something like Aave as well. So in some ways, I think you could argue it's the best of both worlds sort of system.
So so let's talk about a little bit just about risk and like governance of this, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, also in Aave, you have this very risk adverse protocol, right? They everything is mingled together. So governance's main job is just how do we ensure that we don't get in a bad spot? And Maker had the same problem for a long time. Things will change on this front with the end game coming out. at least for like the majority of the assets will be there. And then you can like have, like Morpho, where you have like, I think most of the biggest Morpho vaults today is run by, risk teams. So teams that basically goes in and kind of like handles the risk for you as like a depositor and borrower, right? So there, you have, again, someone else kind of like managing it for you. It sounds like in Euler V2, this is kind of like a little bit put on the user, because if I come in and I open a vault, I need to take some decisions about like, the risk that I want to be exposed to in my vault. How is this setup kind of like being done? And I think like in crypto, we've unfortunately seen sometimes when people are getting too much responsibility, it becomes difficult for them to handle. And that's where I often see, like bad stuff going on. So like, how do you kind of like tackle this? Me as not a risk expert, how do I ensure that, I have a pleasant journey in my usage of Euler?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is another major difference between Euler and Morpho and Euler and other systems. The Euler Vault Kit is agnostic about the model of governance that people use. So I wrote this article in like opinion piece in CoinDesk like a few months back, where I talked about the different risk management models in DeFi, and I broadly categorized it into this like free market model of risk management, the paternalistic management, which is like how Aave governance DAOs work, and then there's this like new model that I suppose like Morpho innovated with Metamorpho deploying assets into the Morpho Blue vaults. So all of those systems are possible within the Euler Vault Kit as well. And I think it's up to users to kind of, and the free market to determine which ones it prefers. And the truth is that all these governance systems have trade-offs, right? I don't think there's a one size fits all. It really depends what kind of user you are. Lots of people do want to be passive lenders, and they do want someone to kind of look after them a bit. So be a bit paternalistic. So in the Euler ecosystem, we have these, we essentially, the vaults themselves can be classified in different ways. And one of them is on the sort of like governance, a governance dimension. So the underlying vaults themselves, if they're ungoverned, then obviously the risk parameters are fixed. And I think those kind of vaults are best service people who are active lenders. They're actually coming in, they know what they're doing, and they're prepared to carry out their own risk management. So a lot of crypto native funds, for instance, will deploy actively in and out of vaults themselves, managing their own risk in this way. They're not waiting for a DAO to make a governance proposal and change some values. Right? They're just like in and out as the markets change. And so I think those kind of vaults are kind of useful for that system. They can also be used, though, as they are in the Morpho system, by passive lenders if you have a yield aggregation layer on top of those base vaults. So in Morpho, everything on Morpho Blue is also ungoverned, and you can create permissionless pairs and so on with different risk parameters, some of which are very, very high risk. And ultimately, at the top of the system, there's an aggregation layer where passive lenders deposit to an aggregator. The yield aggregator usually has a risk curator that manages the risk, and they basically control flows into these lower level vaults. And so if economic conditions are good, everyone's happy and smiling, they might be more risk on, and so they deploy a higher percentage of the aggregated lenders' funds into higher risk vaults. And as conditions change and worsen, they might switch those flows to start to deploy into lower risk vaults. And that's a very different model of governance from what we see on Aave or with the other paternalistic style, right? With Aave, you have active management of the actual underlying loan to value parameters themselves. And these two systems have clear trade-offs, I think. And ultimately on Euler, we support both. So you have yield aggregation vaults that sit on top of everything, and you can deploy into one of those and trust your risk curator to manage risk for you. You have vaults which are directly governed and have loan to values which can be changed by a risk curator or by a DAO, a bit more like Aave. And then you have things that are completely ungoverned. And with those, you can either manage your own risk as a user or ultimately go through the yield aggregator. So ultimately, everything's possible. And I think that's reasonable because it's a free market, and we'll see what the free market favors in the long run. I think there's not a one size fits all for everyone. We all have very different risk tolerances and requirements when it comes to risk management. Some people are more qualified to and have the time and the freedom to actively manage risk. Other people really don't and want to lean on somebody to take care of that for them.
Michael, I wanted to ask you, I asked a similar question to Paul, or actually he gave me a great response that I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on. And sorry for continuing to bring up Morpho. It's just like your mental framework that you have is something similar. So you kind of compare and contrast. So in the Morpho ecosystem, they have the Morpho token. And he has previously publicly stated that the Morpho token represents a share of ownership over the network that Morpho creates over time, right? So you have a bunch of these vaults propping up over time, whatever that means, right? That's a fluffy statement there for now. So I'm curious to hear kind of how you kind of see that kind of similar setup evolving in terms of the Euler ecosystem. And also I wanted to ask the question, which is the token and its role. You previously had the EUL token. What's going to happen there?
Yeah, good question. So Euler token for V1 was a kind of generic governance token. It governed the protocol. The protocol used to accrue reserves, similar to sort of the compound or RFA model. And some of those reserves were used to kind of backstop bad debt, but other could be used also to drive growth to the protocol, right? So they were kind of like a fee and a reserve at the same time. With Euler V2, obviously the vaults themselves don't belong to the DAO as such. They're created by users. And there's essentially a revenue sharing setup where the DAO takes 50% and the user takes the other 50%. So vault creators get rewarded in the Euler system for creating vaults, and then not just creating them, because that by itself is, especially if it's an ungoverned vault, not that complex of a process and doesn't really justify earning a massive fee, frankly. But if they're doing the risk creation and they're also, doing the marketing for the vault and also attracting liquidity providers and so on, then it's clear that vault creators play an important part in the system. So they accrue fees, but 50% of the fee goes back to the DAO. And those DAO accrued fees can be used in a variety of ways, right? They can be deployed back into other vaults that help drive growth into the ecosystem. So that's essentially what used to happen in V1 and what happens on protocols like Aave and Compound, where the fees go straight back into the vaults themselves and get lent straight back out. But we actually developed a really interesting system that's similar to one that it turns out that Uniswap were inventing in parallel alongside us, called FeeFlow, which is fully open source so that people can fork it, and I'm sure they will. Which I think is fun, and I'll tell you about how that fits into the EUL token. Essentially, with all these different vaults accruing fees and all these like mishmash of different tokens, like what do you do as a DAO with that? Like no sane business would run where it's like accruing fees from however many currencies there are in the world, right? And just holding all those currencies on its balance sheet. Usually it would convert them into just like one or a handful of common sense currencies like dollars or pounds or euros or whatever. And so we wanted a system to achieve this in Euler as well. But how do you do that when you have all these vaults? You don't want to have someone like manually going in and clicking buttons and like pulling out fees, right? So we came up with this system called FeeFlow, which is essentially like a reverse Dutch auction that plays out on the fees automatically, and it just runs in the background, completely decentralized way. And how it works is that every period, every epoch, which is usually a few weeks, essentially the fees get auctioned off to the highest bidder, and the price of the auction starts high and starts to decrease slowly over time. And of course, the fees themselves start low and start to rise over time. And at some point, these things cross. And at that point, there's profit to be made for whoever wants to claim the auction. It's completely permissionless to claim the auction. So if the fees are worth $110 and the auction price is $100, then there's $10 profit to be made. And so what people can do is they can essentially swap in and pay for the right to purchase the fees from the markets. Now the question is, what currency do they use to pay for the fees in the markets? And that's where Euler can come into the system if the DAO wants. Essentially, if you put Euler token as the fee bidding currency, then essentially the DAO is auctioning off fees in return to acquiring Euler token back off the market. So kind of like the maker buyback system. With those repurchased Euler tokens, it could then the DAO can redistribute them through staking initiatives. It could burn them. It could use them to pay for contributors. There are lots of things that could be done. And of course, it doesn't need to buy back Euler tokens. The DAO could buy back dollars. It could buy back ETH. It could buy back LP tokens. There's any number of currencies. And so I think it's really up to the DAO in the long run what it wants to do to drive growth towards itself. It maybe doesn't necessarily make sense always to do buybacks, especially in the early days of a business. Most traditional companies don't do that. They don't do like shareholder stock buybacks and so on. But it's a fully flexible system, and Euler token remains the governance token of the DAO, and the DAO can vote to use it in that way if it wants, or to do something entirely different.
Okay, Michael. So I think it definitely sounds that it's like a lot of opportunities on the DAO side as well. And you mentioned like a little bit about the governance, and also some of the governance you didn't like so much with V1. I know also that I believe you have made statements in the past that is really around you believe everything should be on chain, and how you like kind of like the initial governance of Compound, right, where you feel like this was at least in the beginning, it looked like a fresh approach. How it turned out over time is maybe not how we all had hoped. But yeah, how do you basically see the governance in Euler V2, and how are you guys trying to keep this mentality about having as much as possible on chain when governance in most other DAOs happen a lot off chain.
Yeah, I mean, Euler V1 was, the governance has been off chain largely for Euler, and I think it's really tricky. I want it to be on chain. I think there's these two perfect worlds where you have governance systems which are fully on chain, and completely decentralized, and then you have this other extreme where maybe you have what I like to call on-chain corporations, where essentially it's a corporation and it has a hierarchy and it has centralized decision making, but it has some of its key components on chain to make it more transparent and efficient and so on. I think that could be a really optimal setup for new types of corporations in the future. I don't know if there's a regulatory framework in any jurisdiction that would support that today, but I'm sure there will be in the future. But we don't really have that today. And I think I sort of feel like a lot of DAOs sit somewhere in this kind of unfortunate middle, which is just not quite as good as a pure kind of cypherpunk decentralized model, and that just better corporation than we have out in the world. And I don't know how to fix it really. It's tricky. I really liked Compound when they first came online. They had some issues recently, right? There was this I don't know the full extent of it, but there was a reported sort of sounded like some kind of governance attack. Ultimately, getting people to engage in governance on chain, it takes time, it costs money. Direct democracy doesn't necessarily work. So then you have elected representatives, but then do you just hand back control? But then is there transparency around how those representatives are running things? I'm just not sure that we're in the best spot to be honest. So I don't know how to fix things with Euler DAO. I'm just one part of it. I helped bring it to life, but now I'm part of it, and we have to sort of move forward with it as it is. And we try and do things in a transparent way, and sort of move towards that goal of long-term, fully on-chain decentralization. I don't think there's a way to make Euler DAO an on-chain corporation or anything like that. I think it's that's something for somebody else to take the baton with and run with and try and create in the future. But I do think that would be, I do think we'll see, corporations in the future doing that. And I do admire that model. But I think for us, Euler DAO needs to kind of follow probably the path of projects like Maker and Aave and try and figure it out. But one thing I know for sure is that DAOs are good at making certain types of decisions and really bad at making other ones. And I don't think what I didn't like about Euler V1 in particular is DAOs having making decisions over risk parameters. I just think that makes no sense. So I think we're in a better place where DAOs tend to now form engagements with specialist risk managers, like Gauntlet and Chaos and other folks. I think that makes a lot more sense that kind of that job is handed off to somebody who's a specialist. But I really didn't like that about V1, and certainly, hopefully, Euler DAO will avoid making that kind of mistake this time around.
I think we could spend all day trying to solve DAOs, but we won't really get anywhere. Gentlemen, I think this is a perfect place to wrap up. Just a couple last questions for you, Michael. Anything you want to plug? What can people look forward to from Euler when launch? Anything you want to shill?
Just the protocol itself. Come and try it out when it launches. It'll be live on Euler.finance. It won't be very long now at all. I can't say too much, obviously, about exact dates and so on. But needless to say, we finished all our audits, and the protocol will be coming to Ethereum mainnet in the very, very near future. So please do just come and check it out. Give us feedback. Find bugs on the website. Tell us what's confusing, what you like about it, what you don't like, and so on. We'd love to see that. Just as much feedback as possible. In the future, we've got other stuff coming. Coming as well. I mean, we've made no secret about the fact that we've had ambitions to build an exchange, and that's actually almost ready. It's been on pause with the launch coming up of the lending protocol, but we another day I can tell you about the plans for a decentralized exchange built by Euler that is kind of custom built to work very, very closely with the lending protocol and the kind of interesting features and things that enables. So look out for that in the medium term, I would say.
Yeah, we'll have to have you on once V2 is out, and of course to touch on that. Very exciting. Any final thoughts or parting words, Gustav?
I mean, I'm super excited to hear everything that you guys have in store for the community, Michael. So yeah, I think that you guys have done like an amazing job of like bouncing back and has taken like an approach that I think will be very interesting to follow. So yeah, like good luck with everything, and I hope there's a place for us as Stable Lab to come in and work a little bit on the DAO governance as well, of course. But yeah, I'm really excited for everything you guys have coming out.
Thanks for having me on. It's been great to sort of like get into the weeds of stuff. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, Michael. Thanks, Gustav. We'll see everyone on the next episode of StablePod.